Thank you all for joining our webinar on NATO and the rise of the far right. Today we will be talking about the history of NATO from its inception, focusing in particular on stay-behind networks and counterinsurgency programs, the militarization and the rise of the far right currently, as well as the resulting austerity measures due to increasing militarization and the urgent need to resist this militarization. I just realized I muted myself, so I will start again. Thank you all for coming to our webinar on NATO and the rise of the far right. Today we will be talking about the history of NATO, focusing in particular on stay-behind networks and how these extended beyond NATO countries. Then we will go on to the militarization and the rise of the far right currently, as well as the resulting austerity measures due to increasing militarization and the urgent need to resist the militarization under NATO and beyond NATO. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about who we are. We are the Resist NATO Coalition, a coalition that has come together to oppose NATO around the world. And we have focused in particular on the upcoming NATO summit at the moment, which will be held in The Hague on the 24th of June. And our members across the country, around the world actually, have been working to mobilize a counter summit and other resistance actions. And we'll also be sharing more details about this at the end of the webinar. And our coalition members have agreed to the following points of unity. We oppose NATO as a US-led military alliance that is a prime actor in imperialist wars of aggression and military occupation, resulting in the deaths and displacement of millions of people. We oppose US-NATO strategy of expansionism and intensification of militarization across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe at the service of US geopolitical and economic interests. We oppose US-NATO strategy of security through wars of counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and mass surveillance. We support the right of peoples and nations to self-determination and sovereignty, and their right to resistance against imperialist aggression. And we support a just peace through resolving the root causes of armed conflicts, allocating resources not to war, not to the war industry, but to serve people's needs. And now we can get started with our webinar, NATO and the Rise of the Far Right. Like I said, the first part will be focusing on the stay-behind networks. After World War II, the United States and Britain launched one of the Cold War's most secretive operations, the creation of stay-behind paramilitary networks across Western Europe. These clandestine armies, coordinated through NATO and set up by the CIA and MI6, were allegedly designed to organize resistance in case of a Soviet invasion. Their existence was hidden from both parliaments and the public with operations run by military intelligence in each country. The structure of these secret armies was modeled on Britain's wartime Special Operations Executive, specializing in sabotage and guerrilla tactics. The recruits of these groups trained alongside elite forces like the US Green Berets and the British SAS, preparing for sabotage and covert warfare. Even though it is alleged that the threat these networks aimed to counter was a Soviet invasion, this was not really the case. Western governments were deeply concerned about the strength of communist and leftist parties in different European countries like France and Italy. And these stay-behind units were tools to sabotage any attempt at democracy and change for the better, causing indiscriminate harm on civilians and blaming it on these groups, orchestrating coups and more. One of the most prominent examples of these stay-behind networks was Operation Gladio in Italy. Operatives from Operation Gladio carried out acts of terrorism, such as bombings and assassinations, targeting civilians, and then blamed these on leftist groups, anarchists, or communist parties. This was done in order to discredit the political left in the eyes of the public, as well as to create a climate of fear that would justify an increasingly authoritarian response from the military and right-leaning elements of the state. This approach came to be known as the strategy of tension, where the state itself orchestrated violence against its own citizens to manipulate public opinion and political outcomes. And this can be traced back to the end of the Second World War. In 1948, the CIA intervened heavily in Italy's first democratic elections, ensuring that the communists were kept out of power. If Gladio was ever truly a network intended to resist a potential Soviet invasion, which is quite doubtful, it definitely showed its true colors and evolved into a tool for domestic counterinsurgency and political manipulation during the height of the Cold War. Throughout the 1960s until the 80s, Italy endured a period known as the Years of Lead, marked by a wave of bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings. It has come to light that Gladio and its associated far-right groups orchestrated some, if not all, of these atrocities of the era. And one of these was the 1969 bombing at Milan's Piazza Fontana, which killed 17 people. Although anarchist Giuseppe Pinelli was initially blamed, subsequent investigations revealed the involvement of neo-fascist groups such as Ordine Nuovo, who had close ties to the Italian military secret service. The police explosives expert who provided false evidence to frame the left was later found to be a member of this group himself. In 1972, the Peteano massacre, where a car bomb killed 3 police officers, was also initially attributed to the Red Brigades. Years later, Judge Félix Casson reopened the case and discovered that the explosives used came from a Gladio arms cache. His investigation uncovered a web of collusion between right-wing extremists, the military, and intelligence agencies. The man convicted for the bombing, Vincenzo Vinciguerra, later described the logic behind these attacks. Civilians were deliberately deliberately targeted to create fear and force the public to demand greater security from the state, even at the cost of their own freedom. In his words, people would willingly trade their freedom for the security of being able to walk the streets, go on trains, or enter a bank. This was the political logic behind the bombings. They remain unpunished because the state cannot condemn itself. The most devastating attack was the 1980 bombing of the Bologna train station, which killed 85 people and wounded over 200. Once again, the attack was initially blamed on left-wing groups, but evidence pointed to fascist groups with direct links to Gladio and NATO-supplied explosives. Official investigations eventually confirmed that weapons and explosives provided by the CIA and MI6 had been hidden throughout Italy for use by stay-behind operatives and were deployed in these attacks. Judge Casson's investigations in the 80s and 90s were instrumental in exposing the extent of this state collusion with far-right terrorists. He found that not only had Italian intelligence agencies manipulated evidence and obstructed justice, but that the entire stay-behind network operated with the tacit approval of international partners. I would now like to highlight two significant cases involving stay-behind networks where covert operations played a crucial role in escalating tensions between two NATO member states. In both instances, these clandestine activities contributed to pushing allied countries toward open conflict, each hoping to expand its territorial control. Sorry, that's a mistake. Not allied countries, but NATO countries. And I will start with Turkey. Although Turkey remained officially neutral for most of World War II, the period saw strong support for Hitler and Mussolini among Turkish nationalists, particularly within the pan-Turkism movement, which advocates for the unity of Turkic peoples. And this became intertwined with Turkish nationalism and continued to influence Turkish political culture well into the 20th century. After World War II, the United States prioritized integrating Turkey into the Western anti-communist defense system, recognizing Turkey's strategic value as NATO's southeastern anchor and its proximity to the Soviet Union. Turkey joined NATO in 1952, becoming a critical military outpost and recipient of significant US military aid, building the second largest armed forces in NATO after the United States itself. To secure Turkey's loyalty, the US leveraged the dominant and sometimes violent pan-Turkism movement. Alparslan Türkeş, a key nationalist leader, played a central role in this process. After a failed coup and exile, Türkeş returned to found the Nationalist Movement Party, the MHP, in 1965, establishing the Grey Wolves as its militant youth wing. The US and NATO, concerned about internal rebellion and Soviet influence, supported the creation of special warfare units in Turkey, such as the Tactical Mobilization Group, later renamed the Special Warfare Department. These special units were involved in covert operations, including false flag attacks designed to create internal tensions. Notably, the 1955 bombing of the Turkish consulate in Thessaloniki, blamed on Greeks but actually orchestrated by Turkish operatives, triggered the Istanbul pogrom. Over 2 days, mobs attacked the homes of Greek people and the businesses of Greek people in Istanbul, resulting in deaths, injuries, and widespread destruction. The Special Warfare Department also played a pivotal role in Cyprus, founding the Turkish Resistance Movement, TMT, in 1958 and organizing provocations that paved the way for the 1974 Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Cyprus became the first major test of Turkish special forces, with similar tactics later used in other regions such as Kurdistan. After World War II, Greece did not find peace. Instead, frustration among the Greek left, who felt betrayed by the post-war government, led to renewed conflict. By the fall of 1946, leftist partisans had taken to the mountains, launching a civil war against the British-backed government and the local right. At this time, Britain had been weakened by the war and realized that it was incapable of maintaining control, and therefore appealed to the United States in 1947, the newly emerging imperialist hegemon at the time. Despite concerns in Washington about the corruption and human rights abuses of their new Greek allies, it was more important for them to contain progressive movements, and they therefore announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947, convincing Congress to intervene directly in Greece to prevent a communist takeover. This marked the first major US intervention of the Cold War, setting a precedent for future American foreign policy. US forces, equipped with heavy military hardware, arrived in Greece. The left-wing partisan forces were vastly outnumbered by the combined might of US special units and Greek right-wing forces, including the Hellenic Raiding Force. The United States also launched covert operations, including Operation Torch, which involved the use of napalm against Greek partisans as well as civilians, which contributed to the defeat of the resistance by late 1948. This meant that the USA secured Greece as a staunchly anti-communist state and a reliable US client, even before it joined NATO in 1952. From the late 1940s onward, Greece became a major operations center for the CIA in the Mediterranean. The agency used Greece as a base for intelligence activities, targeting countries such as Libya, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Cyprus, and Syria. CIA investment included millions of dollars, secret training centers near Mount Olympus, and the establishment of 800 arms caches across the country. The Hellenic Raiding Force, LOC in Greek, created by the British in 1944 and later supported by the CIA, became both an elite domestic force and the Greek branch of NATO's clandestine stay-behind network, known as Operation Sheepskin. This network was designed to resist potential Soviet invasions, again, allegedly, as well as suppress internal dissent. It's important to note that these special forces have also been integrated into the Cypriot army. US influence extended deep into Greek politics. In the 1960s, the CIA worked closely with the Greek monarchy and right-wing military officers to manipulate the political climate. In 1965, CIA Chief of Station Jack Maury, in coordination with King Constantine, orchestrated the removal of Prime Minister George Papandreou, fearing the rise of his left-leaning son Andreas Papandreou. This interference set the stage for the 1967 military coup, known as the regime of the colonels, which installed a right-wing dictatorship. The CIA advised Hellenic Raiding Force played a key role in maintaining control and suppressing opposition. The Greek junta's support for a 1974 coup in Cyprus, aimed at uniting the island with Greece, triggered a Turkish invasion, the one I've mentioned before. Turkey occupied about 40% of Cyprus, a division that remains unresolved, an occupation that is ongoing to this day. US policy in Greece was marked by a willingness to support authoritarian measures in the name of anti-communism, shaping Greek politics and regional dynamics well into the present. The second part of our webinar will focus on counterinsurgency programs outside of Europe. And our first speaker Sorry about that. Our first speaker um, it was going to talk about Kenya, but as you know, Kenya has been devastated by hundreds of years of imperialist aggression, and this means that he does not have access to the best internet. So we will hopefully get back to Kasheke later, talking about counterinsurgency programs in Kenya, and we will continue with counterinsurgency in the Philippines.
All right, thank you so much, Alexi, for that historical overview. And as Alexi already mentioned, hopefully we'll still get a chance to go back to Kenya afterwards. So just to talk a bit more about the Philippines. So basically what we saw, like the implementation of counterinsurgency, anti-communist intervention by the US continues up to today. And one of the big examples of US-led counterinsurgency and also strong people's resistance against this is in the Philippines, happening at the moment. So my name is Evie. I'm with Friends of the Filipino People in Struggle, FFPS. We're a global solidarity organization that supports the struggle of the Filipino people. Um, so just to start also with, let's see. Okay, so just to start with the US's pivot to Asia. So actually already in 2011, under President Barack Obama, the US announced that they will pivot to Asia. They will shift their attention more to the Asia Pacific to secure their dominance there, signaling that they want to contain the rise of China. So one of the examples here is the picture where they're creating this first island chain, And as you can see, it's directed to trying to encircle its competing power. So this also led to increased US militarization in the Asia Pacific to ensure the defense of its interests. Now, what's also interesting there is that we see the NATO 2030 initiative, which really highlighted China as one of their principal security concerns. And as a result of which, several NATO member states have developed Indo-Pacific strategies. So, for example, Canada, France, Germany. Um, so we can see that NATO also follows this shift of Asia, following moving their front of war to the Asia Pacific. Now, the main reason for this is, of course, that NATO really has to be seen as a US imperialist tool. So I think sometimes there are some assertions by European imperialist countries that they are on the similar footing, or that NATO is kind of like a standalone organization, but we can really see it as a tool of US imperialism to try and defend its interests. So we see this with the shift to Asia, but also, for example, the increased militarization after the push by Trump, and also in the historical evidence that was presented earlier. Um, Now, as what follows this imperialism of US is usually extreme violence against the people that it exploits and oppresses, and also some form of counterinsurgency, especially after 9/11, which it puts in the framework of combating like quote unquote terrorism. So this framework really helps them in basically trying to go to dehumanize the people that it's attacking. It doesn't need to care anymore about human rights because it can just blame them as, oh, these are terrorists, so we're justified in our attacks. So it also really means that we need to defend the people's right to respond to imperialist war, the people's right to wage national liberation movements, and also highlight their perspective. So highlighting the national liberation movements in the global south as well. So specifically, the Philippines, it's been under U.S. neocolonial domination. It was colonized for more than 100 years under the U.S. after a bloody war of occupation. Almost one-eighth of the population got killed by the U.S. troops. And even up to today, although the Philippines is nominally independent after the Second World War, there continues to be U.S. domination militarily, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. So this is through a lot of different means of the US. So some are, for example, military agreements and treaties, or unfair economic policies and loans, or even direct CIA intervention or misinformation campaigns, such as during the COVID, for example, there was a big misinformation campaign against China and the Chinese vaccine. Um, as a result of which, the Philippines had one of the lowest vaccination rates. So what we can really see also is that the Filipino people are not poor, they are really overexploited. And this is all for the super profits of the US imperialists and the big companies that are active there, especially because there's a lot of cheap raw materials for the cheap labor, and to dump their excess production goods. As you can see in the picture, it's also very strategically located because it's very close to to the China mainland, and almost one-third of the world maritime trade passes through key water straits there. So it's very strategic for the US, and sometimes they even call it their unsinkable aircraft carrier. So that's the intensity with which they dominate the Philippines as well. And the current president, Marcos Jr., and even previous administrations, they all have maintained or expanded military agreements with the US government, ensuring that the US has a stronghold in the country, preparing to drag it into its war efforts against China. So those are some of the bases that are highlighted there under the Advanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. These are 9 bases, but there are even more than 8 undeclared ones. And currently, there are US-Philippine military exercises in which more than 9,000 US troops are participating. And they're like demonstrating their new missile systems, the Typhoon missile system, which can reach Chinese mainland, and other war materials that are really geared towards provoking China. So it's really trying to use the Philippines as a military asset. And this is all pursued with the help of their puppet government in the Philippines. So when we look at how the US wants to, also control the Philippines. It's not only through those economic ways, but also through direct counterinsurgency and military intervention. So there's a lot of military aid towards the puppet government. There's a lot of arms deals. Even recently, there was a $5.6 billion arms deal that was approved by the US government. It's not yet pushed through, so we can still try to counter it. But this is a big example of how it is supporting the Philippine government, even though it has been proven to be fascist and hurting people on the ground. So this is, I think, for around 20 military jets that it will deliver, and a number of bombs and other war material. And these weapons are not really used in defense of the country, for example, but it's really used in counterinsurgency. And that is patterned after the US coin or US counterinsurgency dictate. And we can also see direct participation by the US. This was proven, for example, by a crash of a US military contracted spy plane in February 6. One US military was killed in there, and three what it called contractors. They might have been CIA agents. They were, as they called it themselves, having routine support missions for the AFP. But of course, nothing routine is about US intervention in the Philippines itself. And also the previous week, there were military troops of the US that were spotted in counterinsurgency patrols. So we can really see the direct military intervention in the country as well. And so the whole of the Philippine counterinsurgency strategy is basically patterned and directed by the US. So for example, there was our Operation Enduring Freedom, where the US had joint military operations and extensive counterinsurgency training to the armed forces of the Philippines. And we can also see it in the implementation. So there's a strong focus on targeting and militarizing civilian communities. So for example, it uses the clear, hold, develop, where it supposedly clears the area of what it calls insurgents or terrorists, and then tries to hold the civilian area. And then its development, of course, means gearing it within the US imperialist puppet government. Also, the Philippines implemented an anti-terror law and a national task force to end local communist armed insurgency. And all of these are basically trying to shape the entire civilian bureaucracy under the military. So, for example, even the Department for Children is part of it and would be under the military leadership. So, trying to use all the parts of the bureaucracy to gear it under a militarist approach. Sorry. And so the aim of that counterinsurgency is to really fully subvert the Philippine Islands to US imperialist interest, because there is a strong resistance movement and dissent by the Filipino people. So as concrete, evidence of what happens in a counterinsurgency is we see a number of war crimes that take place, and basically a de facto martial law especially in the rural areas. So there's cases of hamletting, bombing, strafings, forced surrenderies, abductions, and extrajudicial killings. So in the bottom left, you see an example of the killings of open legal activists in indigenous communities in Panay. So that's kind of part of the clearing, no? So they try to clear these prominent activists, and then afterwards they occupied the community that these activists came from. So I think even up to this day, these communities are still under strict hamleting. So that means military checkpoints, such as, for example, also in the picture in the top right, where they were blocking a human rights mission in Quezon that was trying to investigate strafings there. So basically, they really militarize entire communities, putting them under 24/7 watch by the military with checkpoints where, you're searched, your phone is searched, everything. And also, of course, it brings violence into these communities by the military, or even also first surrenderies, where civilians are forced to declare themselves as former rebels when actually they're just civilians. And there was also the prominent case of Jed and Janila in the middle on the bottom, who were abducted by the military. Luckily, they were able to be freed because they very bravely, during a press conference where the military expected them to declare their support for the military, they shared their story and they came forward. So there has been thousands of cases of war crimes that have also been exposed, such as, for example, by an International People's Tribunal of the previous year. And one of the results of also these legal procedures against these war crimes is the arrest by Duterte by the ICC. But of course, there should still be a push to also arrest Marcos and all the other cronies that were responsible. Especially also the bombings really tried to clear whole areas in the Philippines and displace tens of thousands of peoples, and usually are followed by mining operations, for example. So just to also talk a bit more about, um, the people's resistance in the Philippines, because the people themselves are very strongly fighting back. Um, And just a short answer to the question in chat. Marcos is still alive, Marcos Jr. So if you maybe remember Marcos Sr., that's the previous dictator in the Philippines. Now his son is back on the presidency, trying to regain the wealth that they lost when his father was toppled. And so the Philippine Revolution basically continues on because the People's Mass Movement, it's the strongest counter to the de facto martial law in the Philippines. And the strongest answer also to war crimes and other forms of fascist violence. It exposes this counterinsurgency and fights back. So it arouses, organizes, and mobilizes people for genuine change and for a just and lasting peace by really addressing the root causes of the civil war. So by national and social liberation, so real change. So that's also something that we really want to highlight, that the people have the right to fight against oppressive rule and that they have the right to fight for national liberation, especially when also imperialism is waging war already on the Filipino people. They have the right to fight back. So we also need to assert that the people's armed struggle in the Philippines is a legitimate and necessary answer to the imperialist war there. And what's also very powerful about the Philippine Revolution, it's one of the longest running liberation struggles in the world. It's been undefeated for more than 5 decades. And its main form is the armed struggle in the countryside. But that's very closely linked with cultivating the rural mass base and organs of political power and advancing agrarian revolution and mobilizing the peasant masses. So it's trying to gradually expand its forces to weaken the enemy um, and liberate more and more areas. An important actor to also highlight there is the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, which is the united front for the revolutionary struggle, which brings together like the workers, the farmers, and all different sectors and classes for revolution. Now, why I'm also mentioning there, it's a co-belligerent in a civil war rather than just an insurgency. So it's really, there are, sorry, there are liberated areas in the Philippines where basically tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are no longer under the jurisdiction of the puppet government, of the US directed government, but they are already in liberated zones. They have their own judicial system, they have their own health system, education system, and they even have marriage. For example, they have already equal rights in marriage, same-sex marriage, which is something that the Philippine government, the reactionary government, does not have. So just to highlight also that it's a very strong struggle, and basically we can see it as a civil war, which is why sometimes the counterinsurgency is put under quotes because, of course, the US tries to downplay the role of the revolution and try to limit it to a certain small number of groups, but actually it's a very strong people's movement that's fighting back. Um, And so, as it consolidates political power, it's also posing a really a threat to US imperialism. Because if the Philippines would be liberated, it would be really a huge blow to US imperialism, because it would lose one of its important and strategic semi-colonies. So it would also increase imperialist crisis in the US empire itself and be a key strategic weakening. It's currently also one of the key deterrents for the US to fully use the country as a launching pad for a war against China. It also prevents the US from using the armed forces of the Philippines as a proxy army because they're now tied down in the civil war as well. So when we're supporting the Philippine Revolution, it actually becomes a part of the global anti-imperialist struggle. Oh, sorry, I misclicked. Um, So just to round it off, it's very essential for us, as internationalists, as anti-imperialists, as those who are against NATO, to also support the oppressed peoples of the world and their national liberation struggles, that are turning inter-imperialist war into revolutionary war. And these national labor movements are really the strongest weapon against US imperialist domination. So for building solidarity with the Philippine Revolution, it's also important that we educate people on what's happening on the ground and that we try to organize also stronger organizations and mobilize folks to really show our support to the revolution and to counter US-led NATO aggression. So one of the ways that you can also join is joining the Resist NATO campaign, which we're also part of, and really highlighting the national liberation movements as an important aspect of the anti-imperialist struggle. And of course, I would like to encourage you also to become a member of Friends. We have a number of solidarity groups around the world, and also if you're an organization, you can join FFPS to be a friend of the Filipino fighting masses. So I think this is the end of my presentation, and I'll pass the word back to whoever will be next.
Our next speaker will be Kasheke from Kenya, talking about counterinsurgency and foreign militarization in Kenya. I'm looking forward to this very much. Kasheke, are you ready? Can you hear us? We will continue with the next part and hopefully get back to Kasheke.
Okay, hi everyone. Then for now, we're gonna present you the part on, wait, can you switch the slides back to part 3? Yes, okay. So we're gonna continue with part 3 for now, then maybe we can try to present you the other part later. I will present you this part. In this part, we're connecting the war narratives by NATO to current politics, and militarization and the rise of the far right, and how these are connected and how they're driven by the narrative of war spread by NATO. I'm struggling. Okay, sorry. Struggling
Pia,
to.
Pia, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think we might have Gasheke back now. Can we give it
Okay,
a try?
I'll try with him.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for working with the tech issues. Gasheke, can you hear? Are you able to present? Okay, our apologies. It looks like Gasheke is trying to speak on his end. He can hear us. We cannot hear him. So we'll keep working on the tech and maybe, yes, we'll pass it back to you, Pia.
Okay, then we go back to the slide. Okay, so again, part three. The part is about connecting the war narratives by NATO to current politics, and militarization and the rise of the far right, how these are connected and how they are driven by the narrative of war spread by NATO. So first, to introduce you to our fourth point of unity. So we oppose NATO's role in enabling the rise of far-right and authoritarian governments in Europe, which use militarization and fear-driven narratives to erode civil liberties, suppress dissent, and undermine democratic rights. So in this part, I'm going to talk about how politicians on the right spectrum are trying to erode democratic institutions and the constraints through different tactics. And I will focus on fear mongering. So for the people that don't know, this just is a phrase for exploiting feelings of fear by using exaggerated rumors of upcoming danger. And you can see this in the war narrative spread by NATO and in the doomsday packages I'm going to talk about in a bit. Another tactic is nationalistic appeals, used by the far right and also by the right, often resulting in xenophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric. Ultimately, using like these tactics are used to manipulate institutions as well as the citizens to justify and legitimize their imperialist expansion and their war aggression. So first, I will show you this person. This person is called Tino Schruppalla. He's the chairman of the AfD, the German far-right party. And to read you his quote, he states, "Whoever votes for Merz votes for war." And on top of that, he also says that NATO fails to consider the interests of all European nations, adding that it is currently not a defensive alliance, as he states that the defensive community must expect and respect the interests of all European countries. And so far, Europe has been forced to implement America's interests, and they reject that. So again, this is a right-wing politician saying this. Merz, by the way, that he's talking about is a chairman of the right party in Germany, the CDU. And yeah, this kind of shows how the far right party's approach to security and defense is very paradoxical, because they are against supporting Ukraine, for example, and they are against investing in NATO, and they are against NATO in and of itself. But at the same time, they advocate for bolstering security and defense to reduce illegal migration and prevent what they call external threats. So basically, they want strong security and they want to invest in it, but they don't want to do that with EU nor NATO. So to get a bit more detailed into this, this is an overview of right and far right parties from the Netherlands, France, and Germany regarding their position on NATO, their war and security policy, the narrative that they use, and NATO's role in this narrative. So to kind of understand their similarities, but also their differences regarding NATO. Very important to state is that they're both very pro-war, but in different ways. So for the right parties, their position on NATO is very pro-NATO, and they are Atlanticists, which basically refers to the ideological and political alignment with the US and other Western states, especially through institutions such as NATO. And they support NATO as like a Western defense institution, and they even favor US leadership in it. And they push for this Western unity against the perceived threats that they talk about, which in the past was communism, at some point was terrorism, now more and more is immigration. So it's always a perceived threat. It changes throughout history. So it frames NATO as a defensive institution. Like a main person for this is Mark Rutte, who is a former prime minister of the Netherlands and is now the Secretary General of NATO since last year. Yeah. So for the far right, they're very anti-NATO, but they are opportunistic. They're anti-NATO in the way that multiple right-wing politicians, such as Le Pen in France, have tried to call their nations to leave NATO, actually, as I stated earlier, because they're against NATO, but they are still pro-war. They are pro-war and opportunistic in the way that they change or adjust their stance based on what it is useful for them at the moment. So it's not really consistent beliefs or principles, but it might criticize NATO at some point, but it might support it when it helps their security narrative, like more border control and anti-migrant policies. Regarding war and security policy, the right parties align with the NATO military agenda, especially the increased military spending, while as the far right focus on domestic security, so national military and border control, which means, again, they might oppose NATO's military spending, but they will push for more national military spending. Regarding the narrative that they spread, right parties have this idea, like they spread this rhetoric of liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, which they kind of frame as like an international conflict as part of a global struggle between two different value systems. So for them, they perceive the West and their values against everything that is the non-West. Again, in the past, that was capitalism versus communism. At some point, it was white people against non-white people, and it changes throughout time, but it always stays this idea of the West versus the non-West. And they use this narrative to frame military interventions as necessary actions to protect, well, their values. They try to use this to justify military spending, to justify interventions, to justify global alliances such as NATO, to justify imperialism overall. This obviously also reinforces colonial logics of paternalism. It also reinforces racialized assumptions about who is, how something is supposed to look like. Then for the far right parties, they have a narrative of internal war, which kind of which I'm gonna get into in a bit. I'm just gonna finish this slide and then we'll talk about the internal war narrative afterwards. So in this narrative that I was talking about, what the right is spreading, liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, NATO's role is really interesting because they play like a role of a symbol of legitimate defense and unity, which is again this Atlanticist view, where they view NATO as an agent of defense, while NATO is working as an agent of imperialism. They are, from their side, framed as humanitarian or something like this, while they're actually no legal or ethical justifications, while they are military interventions without mandates, while they are top-down decision-making. So yeah. And now to go to the internal war narrative, which the far right is spreading. First of all, NATO's role in it is different because it's mainly seen as infringing sovereignty, but then it's sometimes used to defend securitization and anti-immigrant narratives, what I was talking about earlier, in a very opportunistic way. They will decide when they will agree with NATO, when they won't. So now to get into the internal war narrative, This is narratives of violence and anti-immigration rhetoric. So this picture is from an anti-immigration demonstration at Dover. So when you see these kind of pictures, you're obviously asking, like, how can these demonstrations exist? Why would someone carry a flag of England that says refugees not welcome? So this is exactly where NATO's war narrative is connected. It's a strategic use of identity politics by the right, as well as the far right. It's political manipulation because they manufacture this ethnic threat and frame national identity as under threat by immigration. They radicalize political discourse for we, as in the people, the natives, versus them, which can be migrants, which can be foreigners, to construct a collective in-group identity, which to them is apparently being undermined by an external out-group identity that for them are migrants, refugees, Muslims, non-whites, communists, any minority you can think of. And they spread an ideology of fear and dehumanizing narratives to socially and symbolically recruit citizens into a larger cause against this perceived threat. So this shifts political debates away from class and economic policy to debates around manufactured idea of cultural survival of this in-group. And it's also very paradoxical again, because they're trying to reach the people while implementing highly liberal economic policies, which one would assume is not exactly in the interest of the average citizen. So this basically shows that identity becomes the focus rather than policy. And this also shows that nationalist violence is not spontaneous, but it's a political tool used by political elites to gain political power. And they also serve to justify emergency measures, legal and extra-legal, to mobilize supporters through fear and to dehumanize perceived enemies, again, which can be migrants, political opponents, any minority group. You can also see that, for example, the AfD, the German far-right party, is rising way more in areas with fewer immigrants, so less interaction, which shows that elite manipulation can preemptively create fear. On top of that, military buildup and NATO's expansionism often also trigger migratory displacement, which far-right actors weaponize to invoke this kind of perceived threat. And NATO interventions are therefore linked in far-right narratives to refugee flows, fueling xenophobia, Islamophobia, and ultimately the call for closed borders and militarized domestic security. And this creates an environment of violence. This can be seen in severely violent state repression, such as used against Palestine protests. So this is a picture of protesters surrounded by police at the University of Amsterdam. You can see riot police. They are beating pro-Palestinian protesters with batons. They come in with dogs. They're heavily equipped. They come in with big vehicles, even at some point with bulldozers. And throughout the last year and years, they've arrested hundreds of people, peaceful Palestine protesters. And this is not only happening in Amsterdam, it's happening in university campuses around Europe and the US. And this really reflects this narrative of violence, which just leads to extreme measures of violence, particularly against Palestine protests that show solidarity with non-white people and the non-West. It can also be seen in the doomsday packages. So this quote, "to secure peace, to prepare for war," is a quote by Clausewitz. He was a Prussian general and military theorist in the 19th century. And he believed that war was always inevitable. And he argued that future wars are inevitable to justify military buildup and preemptive actions. And especially in the Cold War, NATO often cited such ideas by Clausewitz. And the preparation of war is not only happening in terms of the increase in military budgets, but it can also be seen in these doomsday packages. So Brussels asks EU citizens to put together a 72-hour emergency kit to face crisis consisting of food, water, and copies of important identity documents. The doomsday package kind of refers to recent European Union Commission proposals aimed at rapidly boosting European defense, which includes military spending and war economy planning, but also such packages that they want people to put together to prepare for war. The same thing can also be seen in the US, where statistics show that 1/3 of Americans are preparing their homes for a kind of doomsday scenario. And companies that, for example, offer bunker construction services are thriving in the US right now. And in the past year, Americans have spent a collective of 11 billion US dollars on such doomsday preparation packages. So yeah, again, these doomsday packages are just another example to illustrate how this narrative of war spread by NATO is used to legitimize more violence, such as imperialist expansion and the reaction towards protests. And it leads to criminalization of refugees and framing them as potential invaders or threats, ultimately fueling the rise of the far right, of the right and authoritarian governments. So here I just want to refer you back to the fourth point of unity by the Resist NATO coalition, where we oppose NATO's role in enabling the rise of the far right and authoritarian governments. Yeah, this is it for now.
Thank you very much, Pia. Before I move into my part, we're gonna try one time still if Kasheke is here to speak about counterinsurgency in Kenya and foreign
Yes,
militarization.
Amarad, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Sorry for the internet interference. That's a problem I had, but now I'm here. I hope also I'll share some of my reflections about foreign militarization in Kenya, and maybe later I'll leave it for a minute to my colleague Tiffany Mbogo, who's part of preparation of these slides. Is it okay?
Yeah. You should let me know. You should say next slide, and I will change the slides for you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, the introduction. My name is Gashehe. I'm the coordinator of Malaria Social Justice Center, which is a community-based organization where we are involved in community organizing about social injustices in Kenya. I'm still there.
Yep.
Hello, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Kenya is a former British colony. We had armed struggle resistance, Mau Mau in 1940s, 50s. And this is where we had an initial contact with the colonial settlement, with the British military bases, which are involved in Kenya. I really appreciate for this welcome here as a part of international legal people struggle here in Kenya chapter. This topic is very dear to us in East Africa, as we know, the intervention of the imperialist military bases in Africa, AFRICOM, and many others. But the history of Kenya has been a history of military intervention because Kenya is a former British colony. We had an armed struggle with a guerrilla movement called Mau Mau, Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which was crushed by the superior weapons of the British Army. And since that time, the British government has maintained a military bases in Kenya, which was Batuk. And the next slide also speak about this history of military presence in Kenya. So we have different military bases here, which are owned by the British Army. And this is part of the anti-terror campaign, which is linked up with the global terror campaign that is linked with the US, UK, and many other imperialist forces. Kenya hosts a number of these bases. Historically, Kenya has never moved away from being a client state of the United States and UK. And this is a problem that we have. Economically, we still rely on these forces. So also in terms of fighting terrorism, security crisis in the region, we rely on the US, UK military bases and also the training. The apprentices here has remained very, very critical because they continue supporting client regions. That's our crisis that we have in Kenya that has exposed our country to a lot of vulnerability. Yeah. Next slide. Hello. Next slide. As the slide shows, Kenya is a launching part of these military bases in East African region, and Kenya has been invited by NATO to join as a part of NATO base in Kenya. Our president met Biden before, and they discussed on how Kenya can be a NATO state that support military intervention in various places where NATO is involved. In fact, also our president also supported the war in Ukraine, and also the part of this is the African program. These are used to training Kenyan forces, but also for American military logistics. This part of what we are saying, Kenya continue being a space where military intervention is happening in the region, and also the training that's happened here. Historically, Kenya, as I said, and sharing with also with the Philippines, has been the backyard of the imperialism. We have the challenges of military intervention every day, whether it's in Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, all part of the launching part. Yeah. As you can see, the Britain military presence in Kenya dates back in colonial times. Today, it's continued under the British Army training unit in Kenya, but took British training based in Nyanyuki and Archer Post in Laikipia. Each year, over 10,000 British troops rotate through Kenya for live fire access and young warfare training. Whether they are being taken to Iraq, to other places, first of all, they have to report to Kenya, the British training army, which also they have been involved in a lot of human rights violation in Kenya. There is a case of a woman who was raped and dumped in one of the place, or dumped in a septic tanks. A lot of human rights violations, undermining of a Kenyan democratic institutions, human rights violations. So, as the slide saw in 2012, the British Army was involved in a murder of a Kenyan woman, Agnes Wanjiru in Nanyuki, and her body was dumped in a hotel septic tank. British authorities covered up crime for years with no justice for her family. And I think for international solidarity, these are the case that we can pick to amplify in the international spaces. Comrade from Philippines, the struggle they have gone on in fighting against militarization in Philippines, and also all the social movements that are fighting anti-militarization in Europe and North America. I think this is a case that we can pick because it's a very live and relevant case where there was an impunity and lack of accountability by British Army in Kenyan soil, and this shows the um, subservient relationship between Kenyan regime and the British Army, and also lack of strong institution to challenge these military bases in Kenya. Next slide, please. Political and economic interests of the US and Britain. The reason why this army, the US, the UK, the Israelis have entrenched presence in Kenya is because of our neo-colonial state economy. You have a weak economy, you don't have a national leadership. We rely on IMF and World Bank. These institutions are linked up with the US imperialism, UK, and all over the world. So politically, Kenya rely on these superpowers to defend them, to provide training for the army, provide training for the for the police, and that's why even now we have our police in Haiti. Kenya has continued being a client state of the US. Whenever there is a problem, US will come and take our soldiers, our police, and pay them peanuts and take them to Haiti, to Kosovo, and different places where the imperialism is getting in imperialist military intervention. This has exposed economically Kenyans and has continued being indebted with these financial institutions. So anytime Kenya has no power even to compensate their security agencies, so it has continued to rely on these support from the UK and US, even in training for the police, training for the army. The best of Kenyans that they celebrate is those soldiers are trained in the US or Israel. So, and this is a problem of the intervention of these imperialist forces in Kenya. As a client state, Kenya continue to destabilize the region. Any problem, any military solutions, any military interventions in the region, whether in Sudan at the moment, whether in Rwanda, Congo, it is launched in Kenya. Yeah, the UK sees Kenya as a strategic partner to protect its remaining financial and commercial interests on the continent, especially in East Africa. And you can see where Kenya in East Africa, Egypt in the north, and Nigeria in the West Africa, and South Africa in the south. And that's how the imperialists have continued to exploit resources and their commercial interests in Africa. Okay. Yeah, the slide talk about the economical Kenya hosts the massive foreign investments. British company dominate the sector like banking, Barclays, Absa, teas, export, and etc. Kenya economy is export oriented, huge tea plantation land, as you can see, the American corporation. So that's why they have their own bases here in Kenya to protect their commercial interests, to protect their interests and make sure that their military bases continue being here to protect these commercial interests. That's a big challenge, and it has continued to put Kenyans in poverty and hopelessness. That's related also with the protest that is going on now. I hope comrades have seen a documentary that's being shown in the BBC about the Blood Parliament. Many young people were killed last year while they were opposing World Bank and IMF bill. Not different with the Philippines, not different with the Europe, where there's far right movement, fascism emerging, a crisis of capitalism. That's what we can say. It's a major challenge that we are struggling with. Yeah, we continue with the next slide. Additionally, Kenya is deeply indebted to Western financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Last year, we have had a major protest where many of dozens of youth were killed. Loans come with a condition that prioritize debt repayment and assertive measures and social services worsening public debt. Major challenges that we have a huge population of young people who are not in, have no unemployment, in Kenya. Huge population of young people. Foreign militarization protects foreign capital, not the safety or property of Kenyans. Yeah, neo-colonial state, it is here to serve the interest of imperialism. So we have a major problem of violence extrajudicial killing, enforced disappearance, victims of state and police violence is cut across all ethnic and nationality in this country. We have a major problem of extrajudicial killing, systematic cleansing of young people, and this is part of the deepening of the poverty, hopelessness that come with the indebtedness of the country. Our president is a client state of these forces. Every time he's tripping to IMF and World Bank in Washington, in Paris, even not in Paris, recently he has gone to China to try and negotiate for the debt that China has given us for almost 10 years. We're in a major crisis, and this crisis has exposed us to foreign military intervention. Our army is getting involved many times in Kenya domestic issues. Yeah. Sorry, the last slide talk about the resistance that is going on. Following this poverty, hopelessness, a regime that came power promising a lot, but without providing solutions. Madare Social Justice Center, another social movement, sparked a campaign saying Ruto must go. This movement is shaping up, but is anchored on opposing last year finance bill that was imposed by World Bank and IMF that had a higher taxation of the basic needs like food, healthcare, shelter, sanitary pad, all these. And young people came together to oppose this bill. So this movement is shaping up, and you can see today the BBC shared a documentary of the Blood Parliament killings, where many of young people were killed by our security agency, the army, the police. As the slide spoke about, the government has tax increases, skyrocketing cost of living, police brutality against the peaceful protest. The Malala Social Justice Center has played a major role in documenting these cases. What we can say and share is like what happened in Latin America, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, all these places where there was counterinsurgency, the army was involved, the police was involved in a cleansing of young people who are demanding for social justice and human rights. This is the situation we are. Now, the challenge is that because of the support of this client state by imperialist forces, and, and, and now at the moment, even in China also, they are getting away with murder, and this is very horrible. That's why I think this topic is very important, especially linking with the struggle of the Philippines people, because they have been there for many years fighting against militarization. What has not happened, we have not been able to link very strongly. But I think with the International League of People Struggle chapter here in Kenya, the documentation that has continued happening in the progressive forces and United Front in the Philippines, and also in the UK and an anti-militarization campaign in the US. I think building alliances and solidarity, we can learn from each together and expose the soft belly of imperialism, especially in Africa. Not much that has happened. The documentation of these military bases and their intervention in the region has not been very well done. They have this army and these military bases in Kenya. They acquire a repeatable face because of providing a job, businesses to the ruling elite. And I think this is what we need to do to expose them and show their links with human rights violations. I've done a paper before about this on how US, UK, and Israel has continued to train killer police that have continued to kill our people. Most of the police that are involved by these killings, they are trained by Israel, by the US, they are trained by UK, and this is how we can partner. The movement has evolved into a broader anti-imperialist and anti-elite struggle. Activists are becoming too connected in the dots. I think what we need is how to help us document and expose the alliances of the local national bourgeoisie and international imperialist forces that have continued to alliance together and continue to dominate Kenyan space. The Madara Social Justice Center and many other grassroots movements are building on this path. And I think this is a very important platform for us to learn and document together. I don't know whether my colleague is still here called Tiffany Mbogwa, who also participated in preparing this slide that he can share some of his view about the struggle in Kenya.
Thank you, Kacheke. I'm going to move to the last part of the webinar, the part about, so we're moving back from Kenya back to Europe. Oops. 1 second. Yes. Okay. Yes. And on this part, I'm going to talk about the concerted effort to increase military funding within NATO, within national governments and EU level, and the huge impact of the national budgets and consequences basically on welfare and civilian infrastructures with the austerity measures and the gearing up of the economy towards the military, basically, and that is not only happening within financial investment, but also through ideological investment. And I'm going to finish by talking about how to resist. 1 second. First, I wanted to speak about the increasing in the military budgets, basically the call for increasing NATO contributions. A couple of months ago, we had Mark Rutte, who used to be the PM, Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and now is the Secretary General of NATO, congratulating Donald Trump and by saying that they will turbocharge defense spending and production, and together we can achieve peace through security. It became clear only a couple months later that this would not happen as Rutte expected. US had actually cut down part of their funding for NATO during Trump's first term, and that reduced their contribution from 22% to 15.8%. And further cuts were announced for the future, but to specifically the budget that funds civilian personnel for NATO, so not the military personnel. US understands the importance of NATO, though, so to maintain Western imperialism, and therefore is pushing the NATO members to increase their contributions from what they have at the moment, an average of 2% to 5% of their GDP. And to do that, basically, you see everywhere, as also Pia suggested before, there is a fear mongering happening. Rutte has repeated the talking point of the Russian threat. He used the Kaja Kallas, the US top diplomats, warning that Russia has 3 times more weapons than combined NATO countries. This claim has been actually debunked by a Greenpeace report that came out in November 2024 and Stop Wapenhandel. Martin Brook from Stop Wapenhandel said that Secretary General Rutte is exaggerating the military threat of Russia to create more urgency for the raise of NATO budgets at the cost of pensions, welfare, and healthcare. Alternative facts are introduced to convince European people to sacrifice their social security for the benefit of the military-industrial complex. And this is happening also in the European level. EU President von der Leyen, on a press statement in early March, said that we are living in the most momentous and dangerous times. I do not need to describe the grave nature of the threats that we face or the devastating consequences that we will have to endure if those threats would become to pass. And she stated that the question is no longer whether Europe's security is threatened in a very real way. The question is in front of us is whether Europe is prepared to act. And she also stated that we are in an era of rearmament and Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending. And in this press statement, she introduced the Rearm Europe project that you might have heard of, that aims to basically enlist the use of public spending in defense within the national level, the level of the governments, by changing legislation around debt and deficit procedures so they're allowed to increase their debt as a result of the increased military spending. It also aims to create a joint procurement, including 150 billion in loans for defense investment, as well to facilitate the employment of EU budget for defense-related investments so as to mobilize private capital by accelerating the saving and investment union and through the EU investment bank. And then Rearm could mobilize close to 800 billion for joint investments. And simultaneously, except of the Rearm project, you have different think tanks like the Bruegel think tank suggesting the European Defense Mechanism, EDM, an intergovernmental treaty that includes non-EU countries as well, like UK, Ukraine, and Norway, to promote a single EU market for defense to become more independent from the US by 2030. And you might be asking, why is this happening? Especially, why is this accelerating the past couple months? And this is because there is a global arms race that has been designed with several also newcomers from newcomer companies from US and China, and Europe feels that it needs to catch up. The above changes are accompanied by also policy adjustments that further deregulate the arms race and exports. So the new regulation to be voted in early May wants to establish a European Defense Industry Program, EDIP, accompanying the European Defense Industrial Strategy, the EDIS. That would allow for fast-track decision-making for urgent procedures and increase the security actions for Europe, the so-called safe loans to 15 billion from 1.5 billion at the moment. And the European Network Against the Arms Trade, ENAT, published a paper that warns against the one-sided militarized approach to security that profits from the amplification of conflict, the mainstreaming of defense readiness culture, and the strategic stockpiling of weapons. And they point out that the proposed regulation lacks any reference to arms export controls and human rights considerations, while it explicitly encourages exports in government-to-government deals, and its implementation falls short on transparency and oversight requirements, just like all the other funds that benefit the arms industry at the moment, and is strengthening dependency between EU institutions and the armed industry, as well as fully undermining EU environmental and social rules, and will most certainly lead to enforced diversion of civilian resources for war. So it is clear that we are gearing towards a war economy. But now I want to talk a little bit about the costs of that. Between 2021 and 2024, the EU member states' total defense expenditure rose by more than 30%, And in 2024, it reached an estimate of 326 billion, about 1.9% of the EU GDP. And it's expected to rise by more than another 100 billion in real terms by 2027. The gearing of EU economy towards in the 2023 publication of ENAT, From War Lobby to War Economy, the authors highlight that gearing the EU economy towards a war economy will increase the risk of member states taking part in armed conflicts and exacerbate environmental damage and the current climate crisis. Strengthening the arms industry not only diverts much needed funds away from diplomacy, peace building, climate resilience, and social issues, but it also exacerbates the global arms race. Increased production capacity will require more outlets and loosen arms export rules that will further fuel war and repression around the world. So different states have taken different measures to be able to afford the increase in the militarization budget. We see different approaches. For example, Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, they chose for debt economy, so to allowing themselves to borrow more money and to basically change the legal system in order to do so. Then we have Estonia and France. They decided to increase taxation, while Finland, UK, and the Netherlands have decided to cut on welfare and civilian resources. Specifically in the Netherlands, where I am based in, there's major cuts in healthcare, education, culture, and public services. There will be concrete effects in healthcare that already has a shortage of staff, but that is expected to have a higher shortage of staff with an estimated deficit of 266,000 healthcare workers by 2035 if the cuts go through. And in education, we have layoffs already happening in universities and closing down of entire faculties, like the Earth Science Department at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam or the International Psychology Program in UvA. And of course, there is a targeted slashing of research funding. And this is where I want to talk about institutional dependency. So since 2004, there have been strong lobbies that want to co-opt education and promote dual-use research. One of these lobbies is the EDA, the European Defense Agency, that was created already since 2004 as a way to promote defense collaboration in the EU. They lobbied quite hard to allow for dual-use research done with research institutes. And this basically means that the research created for example, an architecture or engineering department on additive manufacturing. This is actually an example from their website. Can be used in defense or military infrastructure. And the same for artificial intelligence technology designed for medical purposes can also be used for surveillance. And that is in the EU level. But we saw also this year in the Netherlands, in October, right after the budget cuts in education were first announced, a letter circulated from the Advisory Council for Science, Technology and Innovation that encouraged faculties to structurally collaborate with the defense industry since their research budgets were slashed. Of course, a few weeks later, a lot of scholars from different universities tried to resist, and a letter circulated by the University of Tilburg, also pointing to the ethical considerations for such an investment, and also mentioning the kind of conflict of interest that the CEO of Thales Netherlands is also a member of the Advisory Council for Science, Technology and Innovation. And Thales is involved in at least one research project in their university, Tilburg University, and also TU Delft, TU Eindhoven, and other technology universities. And Thales basically presents itself as an innovative technology company that ranks 17th among the world's largest arms manufacturers. So there is a vested financial interest in these companies creating an institutional dependency between research faculties and defense, as they can use the research anyways for military purposes. And there is, except of the institutional dependency, we also have an ideological investment, which is kind of concerted efforts to normalize the idea of war, the idea of constant war, this idea of the whole society approach, that we have to gear every single part of society towards war. And you can see that with kind of normalization of compulsory conscription and conscription events happening more often in unusual places, as well as a lot of propaganda in mainstream media. And now I want to end this part by bringing an example and bringing it back to the NATO summit and that propaganda that I was talking about. So the NATO summit happens in Den Haag between the 25th and 26th of June, and is an exemplary of both propaganda and the austerity and oppressive measures taken for peace, to secure peace and security, basically. The NATO tour includes several visits to high schools and secondary schools, and even collaboration with primary schools. It also included serious gaming sessions, photo exhibitions in public space, a mural competition that's actually together with the local art school, the KBK, we try to disrupt, as well as a mobilization of the cultural sector, specifically performance and dance, to organize a Just Peace festival that glorifies NATO as a peacekeeper. And on top of the propaganda, we also have extremely high costs of the NATO summit. Was originally estimated to cost 95 million euros. And only about a week ago, it was announced that it would actually be 183 million euros, so almost double. It would also close the area around the World Forum, where it is set, with fences and checkpoints, and locals won't have access by car, or local businesses also won't have access by car. Main highways will be closed for 4 months, and the route between Schiphol, which is the airport, the biggest airport in the Netherlands, and Den Haag, will also have major disruptions and checkpoints for the entire period before and after the summit. And at the same time, no events are allowed in the city, and police employment would actually be in the dozens of thousands. 27,000 police officers are employed for that week, which is half of the police force in the Netherlands, and the largest security operation in the Dutch police force history. Even police officers themselves think this is irresponsible. And now, rounding off, how can we resist this? So gearing the economy towards war gears our life towards war and death. It is not only financial investments that create austerity politics and limit civilian resources, but also ideological investments that increase dependency in economy of war, allowing for less investment in life and peace. The rise of fascism requires a rise of militarization. So to try to link with previous speakers, basically the pro-NATO and the anti-NATO right that Pia was talking about are both pro-war. So in order to have a united anti-fascist, anti-war movement, we have to unite against war and against NATO. And to unite against NATO and militarism, we have to unite against imperialism. So as we saw from our comrade Evie and Gachike from Kenya, NATO is a tool for US imperialism. Since it's the beginning of its history, NATO was used against the people and their struggle for independence. To resist militarism is to resist imperialism by supporting national liberation movements across the world, asserting that we need a people's movement, grassroots-led and international. A successful national liberation struggle will hurt the pockets of war profiteers, as Evie was suggesting with, in quotations, counterinsurgency in the Philippines. And we can also support struggles here because counterinsurgency, propaganda around counter-terror dehumanizes people on the ground. So the idea of like counter-terror is a neo-colonial tactic that legitimizes efforts of liberation. So because when we talk about terrorism, then human rights go out of the window. And we see this also not only in the global south, but we also see it in the West with banning organizations and banning demonstrations, increasing police brutality, and kind of in the discourse and in the actions normalizing genocide and death. So any type of occupations and protests that link with struggles of national liberation all over the world are a way to resist war. And another point is to resist militarism is to support militant movements that fight against austerity measures all over the world. So for years, militarism and US imperialism via NATO has been oppressing people in the global south, as we saw in the previous presentations. But also we had the refugees and migrants, people that were forced to flee and cross borders, were also oppressed by NATO. And with capital and war coming together at the moment, the border between like global north and south become less relevant. So militarization and war affects all of us, and we see the effects also in the global north. And therefore, the intersection between our struggles become more prominent. An example of this is that now with military bases expanding, you have normally military bases in a lot of the global north happening in rural areas. There is a suggestion that we will have also a military base and NATO hub here in the port of Rotterdam, where I'm based, that will try to bring technology and infrastructure together through also local austerity politics and investing funds in war. So through kind of this expansion in military bases and in such a dense city fabric as we have in Rotterdam, you can easily highlight the intersection between struggles. The environmental and land movements, housing movements, unions that organize in the port, and anti-imperialist and anti-war movements could come together against the NATO hub. And the last point is to resist militarism, is to counter war propaganda in our work and everyday life. This is really important point because the way NATO narrative is being sustained is through concerted propaganda that NATO is there for peace and security. And they are going from primary schools to universities, getting embedded basically in neighborhoods, mobilizing the cultural sector also for festivals that promote their war propaganda. So it's more important than ever to counter that as workers, as teachers, as students, as parents, as neighbors, and educate yourselves and others. Join webinars, organize with Resist NATO, organize education sessions in your city, and counter NATO and war propaganda as a way to counter fascism. And with this, I want to plug in 2 future events. The first is 4th of May. There is a virtual teaching in Dayton. And I'm just going to read the introduction for this. NATO isn't a force for peace. It's an instrument of empire, from backing coups and wars to giving refuge to Nazi high command after World War II. NATO has always protected power, not people. In a matter of weeks, NATO is coming to Dayton once again, with Right Path, AFP, and US Representative Mike Turner playing a central role in American aggression. The summit is emblematic of what the US and other Western powers crave most: war profiteering and domination. Join us on May 4th for a virtual teaching breaking down NATO's imperialist history, its connection to fascist legacies, and why we must organize against its presence in our communities. You can sign up by that link. And the last part is to basically mobilize for the counter summit and the protest. The actual summit happens between 25th and 26th of Den Haag, but the counter summit would happen the weekend before, so between the 21st and the 22nd. And please join the Resist NATO campaign. You can join in any of the working groups, specifically when it comes to counter summit, I think, and organizing the protests. We need more help. And thank you. Thank you for following the webinar and sticking with us through the tech problems. Would Alexei or someone else take over for questions? You can put your question on the chat or raise your hand and unmute your microphone, basically.
Thank you so much, Lil. Yeah, like Lil said, if you have any questions, just raise your hand or put them in the chat. And then if you have a specific question for a specific speaker, just let us know. Otherwise, we will find whoever is most suited to answer. So there's a question about if there are going to be any demonstrations during the actual summit days. And yes, there will be the counter summit on the 21st.
Maybe I can respond to this.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. So there will be a big demonstration that is already organized, is right before, as I said, the summit. During the summit, there will be some actions and some different forms of demonstration. I have to say, as I mentioned before, there's going to be 27,000 police officers only in Den Haag, which is half the force of the Netherlands, and the military police there. And they made sure that they will not allow any other events. We have heard that the place in front of a place where normally they hold protests in Den Haag, the Malievliet, is booked by veterans for both days to make sure that there won't be a protest that is allowed during the the actual NATO summit, but things will be organized. And if you want to know exactly if something is organized on the days of the summit, you can follow Vito, Verzet Tegen Oorlog on Instagram, since we are organizing for those days specifically.
Thank you, Lil. We have a hand raised. Go ahead, Gray.
Oh, thank you very much. I want to um, make a suggestion. I'm from New Zealand, so it may not be that relevant, but it seems to me if the um, European community have had fear provoked from, well, Russia or whatever, that a direct attack on NATO may be seen by many as an attack against their security and may generate greater fear and opposition to your program, and that an alternative approach may be to promote a more effective way of creating security. Now, I agree that's a very, very difficult ask, but I'm just wondering whether you might be sensitive to this reaction against your program and maybe ways of offsetting that reaction.
Thank you, Gray, and that's a very good point. I think it's important for us to point out how belligerent NATO is, as opposed to how it is kind of portrayed by the West and portrayed by the mainstream media as this kind of protector, and expose it for what it actually is, which is an aggressive force which has imperialist ambitions and is actually itself also the biggest threat to European security. And if we are able to point this out with facts, hopefully we will get a lot of people on board and not cause anyone to feel even more unsafe.
I wish you the best. This issue has been increasingly important in New Zealand as well. We're being affected by the paranoia from Europe.
And I also, if I can add something, as we saw from our different presenters presenting on the case of Kenya and the Philippines, any type of increased militarization, especially when it tries to serve U.S. Imperialist interest, it does not make the population more safe. So I think we can learn a lot by looking at other places on the world, especially in the global south, and understanding what this increased militarization actually does to the people.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I do not see any more hands. Maybe I'll give it like a few more seconds and yes, Pablo, we have been using Jitsi for our committee meetings, and I think we should be thinking about alternatives. We just, I guess everyone here is a bit more well-versed, unfortunately, but we have been talking about that.
In the chat, people are asking for slides and a recording. Can you tell us if they're available and where?
Yes, everyone who has signed up will receive an email with both of those things.
Pablo, are you referring to this on the slide, May 4th? Yeah. To my understanding, is a virtual teaching. Maybe Cody knows more about it. Yeah. For the Counter Summit, you can register if you go to internationalsolidarity.org/resist NATO. You can register for the Resist NATO campaign. And then there is a specific working group focusing on that. Yes, thank you.
Okay. If there are no more questions, I would like to thank everyone very much for attending. We all hope you learned a lot today. I definitely did. It was a pleasure to have Evie and Kasheke joining us and giving some very interesting insights on counterinsurgency outside of NATO, and also to Pia and Lil. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice rest of the day, rest of the evening, wherever you are.
Thank you very much. It has been very great, and I really appreciate for the convening. All the best. Great learning, so inspiring. The future is within our hands.